Hello, I'm Margaret Seo, a fourth-year medical student from Barts and the London, Queen Mary University of London. I am also a policy associate at Queen Mary Global Policy Institute with interest in health policy and health advocacy. Today, we're very delighted to have Emeritus Professor Dato Dr. Visweswaran Navaratnam with us to share his experiences and insight on health policy. So first off, Nava, can you share some of the key milestones in your career that led to your current role in research and policy advocacy?
Sure, Margaret. My move into research was as soon as I finished my medical degree, medical program, I had an offer at that stage to go into research. Actually, I originally worked in Parkinson's disease, completely different from it. And so actually my first move from being a general practitioner, if I had gone back to Asia, to a researcher, it started then. That would be my kind of first milestone. And I stuck right through to my doctorate in research. And in the research, in my PhD, one of the areas I was working was on benzodiazepines and benzodiazepine receptors. And the core question at that time we were trying to look is people using benzodiazepines, was it habituation? That was a policy-based kind of thing. Is it the drug or is it the person?
Mm-hmm.
And under what conditions clinically would somebody become habituated to that medication? So if one looked at that, there was some policy implications because and we are going into the early 80s when benzodiazepines were a new entity, minor tranquilizer or whatever you want to call it at that stage, in the marketplace. So that would be my first milestone. Then when I finished, and I became a research fellow in UK still, I was invited to go back as an academic to Malaysia to join one of the universities. And again, one of my pushes to health research and health policy was because when I was interviewed for the job, that time in Malaysia, the doctors never talked to pharmacists. There was a barrier, if you want to call it. And the person who interviewed me, the vice chancellor, said to me, one of the reasons why I'm keen for you to join is you straddle the barrier.
Mm-hmm.
The clinicians will talk to you, and I want you to try and create a program or work on a program where pharmacy students can go into the wards and actually understand. So I suppose another milestone would be when I introduced clinical pharmacy
Mm-hmm.
into the Asian region or in Malaysia. That would be a second milestone. And while working on that, having been trained in neuro research was, let me use the right language, that's hurting people's feeling. I would say backward or very non-existent, literally very low level of research was going on. And so when I started talking to the clinicians there, I said, look, I like to work on clinical research in neuro, etc. There were two areas that they suggested to me. And one of the areas, surprisingly, was on looking at cerebral malaria, because as you know, it affects the brain. That's all they could tell me. Number two, they said, oh, there's this thing. We've got a heroin epidemic coming, and we've got addictive persons, both, again, in the neuro field. So hence, my incursion into research in the Asian region was because those two areas. And those are the two areas I worked through for nearly 30 odd years. Now, as surprisingly at that stage, Malaysia was looking at signing the convention on psychotropic drugs. The Minister of Home Affairs, a very learned person called Tan Sri Muhammad Ghazali Shafi, approached the universities to find somebody who could be an advisor to him. As he said, I don't know what these psycho drugs are all about, but we're going to start working on it to become conventional. I need to understand it. I need somebody who can advise me on these things. The Vice Chancellor, Hamza, came to me and said, look, Nava, you've done work on this area. Can I put your name up? I said, look, I'm wet behind the ears, and I don't think, you want somebody more senior. He said, no, no, no. It's a person who will guide you through. Hence, my first incursion to a national policy work would be then, because I was appointed senior advisor to the Minister of Home Affairs on what they call drug policy, but it was basically looking at the conventions and looking at review. But it opened up a huge number of opportunities, because then, because of that work, I could start looking at treatment policies of addiction, what kind of medications that are being used. As you know, in the late 70s, early 80s, they were using cold turkey for detoxification. So one could say, okay, now that's not the way to do it. Can we change the policy? So that became another milestone of getting into policy research. Now, at about the same time, the World Health Organization invited me to join their expert committee on drug dependence. And again, there it was looking at policies on controlling scheduling, as they call it, recommending scheduling of drugs for control by the UN. At the same time, looking at what kind of treatments and opportunities for addictive disorders were going. It opened up, because that's one of the first things we said is addiction is not only drugs, but gambling, smoking. It was it's an opportunity to expand the whole area of the term, because smoking was not a taboo. Only if you were, so bringing in the tobacco, bringing in alcohol and things like that into the field of control or health policy was another area, opportunity there. And going along the line very quickly, when Malaysia became a member of the United Nations Commission for Narcotic Drugs, I was appointed as the Malaysian representative to UNCND. And normally there'll be 2 or 3 government officials, myself. We go once a year for these commission meetings. And basically, the UN Commission for Narcotic Drugs looked at policy only. And I joined, having come with the WHO group as well. My focus was primarily health-based. So it looked at enforcement, all sorts of policies, but my personal interest was there. And often enough, the scheduling of the benzodiazepine drugs, for example, or a lot of psychotropic drugs into the psychotropic convention, those policies work I could do. And also, I was able to bridge the health aspects with the enforcement aspects, which the UN Commission normally tended to be. They tended to be more, let's catch them, let them put them away, let them lock them away, that kind of attitude. To look, yes, even if you put them away, you need to manage them, you have to treat these people. There's a difference between a drug trafficker and a drug user. And there's different spectrum. So that's another area. So that's another area. I mean, moving along on another platform, I was doing a lot of work on infectious diseases, particularly on, at that stage, malaria and dengue. Dengue was new, but malaria was pretty much across the region. And then I started working on cerebral malaria, management of cerebral malaria, and developed policies for management of cerebral malaria. And went on to look at developing new drugs, the artemisinin compounds, as you may know, which the origins are in China, artemisinin, and a lot of other countries started growing and developing of new products, came out and got very much involved in a lot of the clinical trials, etc. So that became another area. Then to leapfrog a bit, one of the consequences of both injecting drug use was HIV
Mm-hmm.
and AIDS. Um, so I was invited by UN AIDS to join their panel
Mm-hmm.
to look at how do you manage, what are the, okay, what are the policies they were trying to develop. It's a relationship between drug use per se, drug use, injecting drug use, and the management. How do you manage drug users who are also got concurrent HIV, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And again, there was a split that time. How much was sexually transmitted HIV versus injecting through HIV
Mm-hmm.
injectors? So you needed to develop different policies. So that became another area. But a lot of that, that one of the questions often I asked in my on the research we were doing is how translatable is this work?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because remember, most of the primary subjects were Asian. We were working with Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. So primarily our policy work, or we were translating policy work to adapt to those kinds of countries. Vietnam was a challenge, interesting challenge, because they had a mixture of Russian uh, on the north, or Russian influence in the north, and the south was an American influence, maybe I use the terminology, and often enough conflict of how do you bring a common national policy. And they just started developing a national policy.
Mm-hmm.
So they started looking at how to merge. So that was the challenge. It was the interesting thing. Um, so what we started then doing is with ILO and different UN agencies working in Africa
Mm-hmm.
to see how the data we had, how usable and how adaptable is the data, or how reflective of the situation that we could derive similar policies. So
Mm-hmm.
policy adaptation became in Africa was one of the major areas, and later also in South America. So I think the key thing is often enough we found that the data and the assumptions, presumptions we've made is not applicable because they're different styles, different people, different kinds of cultures. Especially with sexually transmitted HIV, it was completely different in Africa, and you can't use the same rule book
Mm-hmm.
and derive. So that was the challenge. But I was fortunate in the group I was working with were very adaptable. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they took that to okay, what we are doing not necessarily fits that, so let's redo it with the African researchers or whoever. Even in Asia, we had to redo a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
In Philippines, Sri Lanka, India as well. Because, for example, in India, when we started working on one of the tropical diseases, uh, they use iodinated salt, the experience, but we wanted to introduce DEC salt for filariasis. Now,
Mm-hmm.
so we have to go back and say there's no DEC salt. You have to find a manufacturer to create DEC salt. How do you tell people now don't take iodine salt, but now take DEC salt? So there was again a community-based policy development aspect that started developing. So kind of that gave another element of it. Okay, rather than go too far, so kind of that just gives you a scattering of the different timelines of work. But I still continue to work with our advice on health policies, both in Asia and in with the World Health Organization. Okay, let me
That
stop there.
sounds really interesting. Um, Second question wise, I feel like you have touched this in the key milestones part, but what are some challenges you face doing some of the projects you've mentioned in policy advocacy and implementation?
The biggest challenge is in the time period I was involved, people did not understand the importance of policy.
Mm-hmm.
Policy was looked as an administrative mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
We documented. It's like write an SOP, standard operating procedure, and that's it. But that is not the end story. One had to You can write a cookbook, but you need to still train the cook how to do it, how to use it. So all that elements, that was the biggest challenge. I mean, in Vietnam, for example, when I first went in and met with the Minister of Health, he said, "Oh, you've done policy work. We want to create a policy. Can you write a policy?" The answer is no. I need to have data. And then you find they did not have the data, the way you could use it, analyze it. So you had to go backwards to find people or individuals to be trained in data gathering, data analysis, and also interpreting the data in a way it can be used for policy. So that was, I think, one of the major significant challenges in that. Second one is quasi-political. Representatives at meetings tended to come with a pre-written agenda. We do it this, and therefore the whole world has to follow. Typical state kind of attitude. You needed to convert them to say the world is not at the windowsill, but there is something beyond the windowsill. You need to look and understand the perspectives that side. So converting people to understand more the global aspects, the implications, because what is good for me need not be good for you. Understand that simple sentence. What's good for me may not be good for you. And therefore, to make it good for two people, there needs to be adaptation. And getting people on board, especially senior policymakers who come with them in those area time with a pre-written agenda, saying we do this and therefore it shall be done, or the big brother attitude. Use that. So that was another major challenge. I think go back a bit. I think the biggest challenge was people did not understand the value of research. If you talk to fundamental research, particularly, they thought, well, why do fundamental? Why not jump straight into the clinical work? And you've got patients, look at the patient do, but you must, to understand some of the consequences of what you're doing, and to be able to respond to them, you needed to get people to do some preclinical work. So in understanding research was another element of it. And also the other thing is the ethics of research. There was certainly in a lot of Asia, there was no written ethical guidelines of what should be done, what cannot be done. So I think there are challenges, but these challenges, with a bit of effort, can be overcome. But they were interesting challenges.
Yeah.
And I think main thing is being willing to listen to the stubborn individual who comes with a fixed agenda, and then trying to convince them there is other things. Was an interesting challenge, but I think that will be a major challenge. Okay.
It seems like keeping an open mind and also like just
Absolutely.
listening and
Yeah,
trying.
listen first. Don't start by saying, I have decided that thou shalt do this. But let's listen to the other side, especially with community research, community-based policy research. One has to be very open. Listen to them, because what they have and what they do or what they need may be too different what we may perceive, because we go there and say, oh, this is the problem, so we need to fix it. And the fix is ABCD, but the ABCD may not be what they need. They may need something more simpler. And willingness to listen to what they need and then adapting what we think is necessary, and then helping them implement policy. Policy research often says once we've done the cookbook, that's it. It's not. It's translating and operationalizing them becomes a bigger challenge and an essential challenge to do. If not, it will not work. It will not work.
Great. And the next question is, You have been a research fellow at like major institutes like National Institute of Health. So are there any like lessons you've learned from your experiences there?
Yeah, with Walter Reed, I was primarily looking at the newer medications for infectious diseases. Kind of two things. One, I was doing with them for that, and with National Institute of Health, I was looking at infectious disease, but also on the regulatory mechanisms of drug or food, FDA type mechanisms. So work with them. It's interesting in many ways because the way they do research and translate research is two different things from how I perceived it.
Mhm.
And certainly they were doing work on beagle dogs, and well, beagle dogs in common in Asia, so you couldn't. But okay, they were using a vehicle. The beagle dogs were a vehicle. That's all. But then taking the data and how applicable is it to man, to the human being, translation, and how do you derive it? What are the commonality? The physiology of a dog is different from the physiology of a human being. That was an interesting thing. I think, and also with the National Institute of Health, um, I enjoyed being attached with the Clinical Research Center because their way of doing work, work culture,
Mhm.
uh, is like we had our grand ward rounds at about 6:15 in the morning, and we were at coffee at 7:45, and actually all the tests you requested by 8:30 were online, and you could decide what you're going to do. And at 9 o'clock, actually people went back to the labs. So kind of, and by 3 o'clock, okay, let's go and have a game of tennis. I mean, the day is finished. I mean, it was a different culture from,
Mhm.
getting up, going to work, etc., setting up things. It's kind of, the system was different. So it was, uh, initially it was a shock, but it was enjoyable
Mhm.
because it balanced quality of life with quality of work. And I thought at the end of it, I would say, I thought we did much more in that style of working, starting very early. I mean, doing grand ward rounds at 6:30 in the morning was kind of first time. Are you sure you're going to do it so early? Kind of question, to suddenly realizing that's the ideal time to do because everybody was there. You could discuss it. And when you grab coffee, all the results you've asked for, because their system was built that way. So I think
Mhm.
that was another thing I would
It
say.
sounds like very
Yes, I think it was
efficient.
a good learning experience. Good
Yeah.
learning experience. Yeah.
Sounds like you adapted a very good working
Oh,
habit.
enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Nice. And I feel like you've also touched a bit on this with the culture nuances with your work in Southeast Asia and also WHO. Are there any specific times that you found there's like culture differences while working with international partners in policy discussion?
Uh, with, okay, I think things have changed over the last 20, 30 years. But in the early years, um, the doctrine in international organization is we know the answers
Mhm.
and we are going to prescribe it, and you, the millions, shall do it. I think that was my biggest fight in my hand. Often enough, what they were proposing was, to me, idiotic,
Mhm.
or they came with a position that we have decided, or our committee has decided, and therefore that's the gospel. And I
Mhm.
said, no, that's not the gospel. We need to understand the adaptation, adaptability of what we want to suggest. And my word is always, we are suggesting a policy, not dictating a policy. The older school tended to dictate rather than guide or advise. But the moment you take the position of advice, you have to be willing to again step back and help them understand, train. So you have to go backwards. So you're going one step forward and 10 steps backwards because the person you're talking to may not understand what you're saying. This was a particular experience I had in Africa, in Zambia. Uh, is the senior people there, can be DG, even minister, deputy ministers, who really did not appreciate, because again, their officers never briefed them, or they had the opportunity to brief them, or they themselves did not understand what they were briefed on. I don't know which is the real answer, but obviously you need to spend a lot of time taking the 10 step backwards and taking them up in this journey forward. But once you got them to the right spot, they were very supportive and understood the thing. So that was one of the issues, I think, I would say, with international agencies. And that's particularly across the whole UN, because I was also a member of what they call Friends to the Secretary General of the UN on drug control. And the Friends group were very senior people from all over the world who had already made up their minds before they came in to what we were going to even discuss. And often enough, they say, oh, in my country, we do this, and therefore, I think we should suggest that, or we should propose that. My answer is, well, have we tested it? How applicable is it? So again, I think attitudes but that has changed a lot, I must admit. And people like Peter Piot, who was in the UN AIDS, was Under Secretary General at the UN AIDS before. Previously, he was one of the instrumental people who helped transform this from a culture of we are going to dictate to we are going to listen a bit more and try and see whether we can adapt what policy is needed to that particular country. So the key thing is adapting the policy to national needs, and then from national needs to the community needs.
Amazing. So, moving on to some of the key policy issues and trends right now, what are some of your perspectives on the current policy landscape surrounding the development for drugs, or like the drug policy background?
Okay, I think right now there are two aspects of it. One, the treatment of different health disorders is changing dramatically. Question is, can AI play a role? Serious question. But that means you have to change a lot of policies. You have to firstly understand and define current limitations for using AI. I mean, without criticism, some GPs will say, okay, NICE says this, and therefore that's the treatment. But the patient, what NICE dictates is a general guide. There needs to be adaptation. So I think, I feel like one of the things we need to train people is to actually not just follow the rule book, but look at the patient, at the subject, and see, does it apply? Or what other alternatives exist? The challenge I had in this similar area was when I was working in India with the WHO group, is the role of traditional medicine. How do you, and often enough they say we take this, but if you don't understand, okay, the immediate reaction was, oh, this is a mumbo jumbo, forget it, tell them stop it, let's go with what we know will work. But the mumbo jumbo may have had both a psychological or therapeutic effect, as well as maybe the content. I mean, now we understand much more of what these traditional medicines contain. Those days, maybe we did not know much, but the fact that it had a role function. So you're blending the traditional practices with, I would call, Western or developed practices together. It's a major research question in health
Mhm.
sector. Even now, I think, particularly in Africa, particularly in some parts of Asia. Uh, and I think that's one of the critical areas of doing it that needs looking at. Um, Training is another area. I think training, uh, before the focus was just training doctors
Mhm.
for healthcare, but doctors are doctors. They're different from public health. I mean, before we say public health, okay, a public health worker can do it, but public health workers don't have, or we did not provide them the necessary skill set to be a real public health carer.
Mhm.
So I think so. There's a lot of changes that's occurring, but we've really not adapted or looked at the policy implications
Mhm.
to this.
Okay. And with these emerging policy issues, how do you normally stay informed, and how does this inform your advocacy efforts?
Okay, for example, right now, let me ask the question. We talk of global climate change,
Mm.
etc. How many people really understand the impact of climate change?
I don't.
We always say, oh, okay, carbon causes this, X, Y,
Mhm.
Z causes this. That's right. They are contributing to worsening the situation.
Yep.
But do you think by stopping cars polluting, gasoline cars, is it going to have a major impact? Where is the impact of?
I
In
think for when people know about climate change, it's probably they see that the temperatures are going up, and then like the ice is melting.
nothing.
But generally, in my opinion, we don't know extensive amount of how this impacts the other and how
Right.
it impacts the climate. Yeah.
Yeah, because I always say is climate change impacts sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
agriculture, things like that. And if our agricultural productivity drops as a consequence, food availability drops, and food availability leads to poverty or starvation or the lack of. It pushes prices up, so increases people on the poverty line or non-affordability line, put it that
Mm-hmm.
way. So I mean, one has to look at it in developing policies is to look at both the consequence of. I've picked this particular one because I don't think we understand the real consequences of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It's like saying, okay, smoking led to cancer of the lung,
Mm-hmm.
but smoking was not the sole contributor to cancer of the lung.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple elements of the cause. Standing in a highly polluted area or living in a highly polluted area may have triggered it, may trigger cancer of the lung.
Mm-hmm.
So they're multidimensional things. So often enough, that's why I said a researcher interested in smoking will only look at smoking and lung cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you say, I want to develop policies or evolve policies that control lung cancer, then your question is now approached to be different. You look at all elements
Mm-hmm.
that may contribute or stimulate the onset of lung cancer. It may be genetic, let's not forget that. It may be environment, it may be living condition, it may be food, it can be multiple things. And like, for example, if a baby is brought up in a highly polluted environment, is there a higher likelihood of that person, baby, developing lung cancer, say by the age of 15, 16, or 20,
Mm-hmm.
versus somebody living in a nice environment, free, but having a different consequence? What are the chances? What are the kinds of risks? So I think the approach to policy research is that would be one of the major challenges.
Okay, great. So moving on to some of your advice for aspiring policy professionals. So for a student aspiring to enter the policy sector in the realm of like global health and health policy, what advice would you offer for them?
My first thing is, okay, if you're interested in health policy or policy in general, because health is only one element of it. And as you may have noticed, health is influenced by environment, the psyche of the and community, etc. And so therefore, I mean, you may be targeting to develop health policies, but an open-mindedness to looking at the environment in which you do your work is critical.
Mhm.
And especially because once you develop a policy interest, once you create it, you need it to be translated and implemented. So you need to get into the community. So
Mhm.
you need to understand the community and the welcomeability of what you are going to say to the community and the way you say it as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a nice challenge, without any doubt. A lot of people ask me, do you regret not being a general practitioner and just gone into research and gone into. My answer is no. I enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed. I finished 104 PhD students in my career, and everyone still keep in touch with me, and a lot of them still do work, though in different elements in different areas, and some of them in pharma. But they always say, "Oh, this means I have to think well and talk to my bosses about this policy." So it's at the background, the policy stream is still there, and I think that's crucial. That's
Mhm.
crucial.
Like for someone still in the studying undergraduate phase, is there any strategies or tips to get them started in health policy?
If you're working on if especially as an undergrad, you have areas of interest.
Mhm.
Like if you to crack a joke, my into neurology or neuroscience came because my professor of anatomy was working on the octopus brain.
Wow.
And when he went on Christmas leave or anything, I was asked to help out by feeding the crayfish to the octopus. And you used to watch that. You knew that by putting it on one side and you gave electrical stimulation, it won't take it. I mean, simple things like that. So, oh, why the hell is this fellow doing this? I mean, so I think curiosity is critical.
Mhm.
Uh, in any research, one must have a curious mind to
Mhm.
ask the question that people, supervisor may say, don't ask a stupid question, but forget it, challenge it.
Mhm.
And I think in as an undergrad, the opportunity to challenge, I would advocate to a lot of the young trainee doctors to challenge current practices, to challenge and look what is written. As I just talked about NICE, NICE is a guideline like WHO guidelines, everything, where a group of us sits and drink coffee and say, yeah, this is the best way to do things. But it is best in the group of 15 or 20 of us sitting around the table who
Mhm.
decided the best practice. But it need not mean the best for somebody sitting in Timbuktu.
Mhm.
They may not have the resources, they may not have so many things. So by challenging and looking, that's why I keep pushing people to look at the community, because finally, who do you impact on your policy? Not the policymaker, not policy developer or implementer, that's the Ministry of Health or whoever, or Department of Health, but the person who has to use, who's affected by it. And the affected person tends to be the patient, the client, or the community. A disabled kid going home to a family, I mean, it's different from a disabled kid going into a family which has got all the facilities. So you need to have, when you develop a policy, it must be adaptable.
Mhm.
And understanding the community and the ability of the community to use it. And again, I think as undergrads, you've got opportunity when you do community medicine, when you go into community, is to understand the community that you work with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important because then you become an asset, not
Mm-hmm.
just to doing your work, because you understand better.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's critical, but often enough, I don't think medical students tend to challenge so much.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, this is it. I regurgitate it. I get through.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot more, and policy research allows you to do this challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
therefore, I encourage young people to look at policy as a
mm-hmm.
sideline in anything you're doing. It may not be the primary target.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So just to observe more and just to put yourself out there and be curious about the trend and the community and what they were lacking would be a good way to start.
Right. Absolutely. You got it,
Nice.
Les, Margaret.
And final question, what role do you see the QMGPI it plays in advancing research and informing policy within healthcare?
I think QMGPI can have a major impact uh, in global health policy, but it means changing its modus operandi.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as I said, if you're going to, well, first and foremost, QMGPI has to decide whether it wants to be a player on the global platform or a player within the institutional platform that's within QM itself. If it says, I want to be a player within the institutional platform, then it needs to bring together all the players or all the researchers and understand what research they're doing and how and which of those research may, and I use the word may, have policy implications, and then try and build into it the policy perspective, because you need to build in the policy perspective very early, because some of your experiments need to have responses to those potential policies. That's one approach you're taking. If you think you're going to be a global player from day one and recognize worldwide as a global provider of responses, then you need to understand what is that the global policy needs are. It's a different kind of ball game. You
Mm-hmm.
need to have very big ears, listen to the world, whether you like it or not, and see what it is. I mean, if you look at Gaza now, what is the major problem? What are the major health issues in Gaza? Nobody's answering that. They
Mm-hmm.
only talk of poverty, which is starvation. I mean, these are key things. No, I'm not saying, I'm not undermining those things. But the issue is what happens after the war?
Mm-hmm.
What about the psychotrauma, the trauma of the kid who's 3 years old? Forget about the trauma of the child born without any parents now. I mean, there's so many, I mean, those are health, social related, because social and health come together very closely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that an area which is more global? Because the response has to be global, you know. And I think, to me, GPI can play a global policy platform. There are a few people there. I think that was what was originally envisaged.
Mm-hmm.
But that means you don't look in-house first, you look outside the windowsill first to
Mm-hmm.
look at the questions that need answering. And then look inside to see who can provide or who's interested in providing the responses to that, or who's doing work that may gel into providing answers to the global needs, global policy needs. Okay.
Amazing. So this is the end of all the questions. Thank you so much